Sarah Friend, and I'm a benefit consultant here at the Partners Group and have the pleasure of presenting on the topic of the Affordable Care Act frequently here at TCG and in our community. I've been in this business for about 20 years, and I'm one of those strange folks who actually loves digging into this law and staying up to speed on the changes, the rules, and then, of course, following all of the very interesting politics that go along with it. Today, I am happy to not be alone in this presentation, and I'm joined by ERISA attorney Iris Tilley from Barron Liebman. Iris, many of you likely know, we actually looked at the list of almost 200 attendees who were signed on this morning, and a lot of you are both clients of the Partners Group and Barron Liebman, so we've got a lot of crossover there. But Iris advises employers in all aspects of employee benefits. She's a local Oregonian. She got her undergraduate degree from University of Portland and both her law and MBAs from universities up in Seattle. And she, like myself, also often speaks and writes about employee benefits topics and healthcare reform. So I am thrilled to have Iris here. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. This morning's ACA update is scheduled to last about an hour, and we do have a lot of content to present. So I'm not sure if we will have time to answer your participant questions as we go along, but I would encourage you to please use the question box on the right. So on your screen, you'll see that webinar toolbar, and towards the bottom, there's a place where you can type questions. Well, even if we don't get to answering those questions during the webinar, we'll be able to print a report that lists all the questions that you posed during the webinar. And then what Iris and I will do is we'll consolidate those and send both the questions and answers out to all of you who attend today. So if we don't address your question, don't worry, you'll get your answers that way, and also benefit from seeing all the questions and answers everybody else posed. You are all in listen-only mode for the presentation since today's topic has proven to be so popular. So we are also recording this webinar, and we'll post it to our website. So if you do have other team members that you think would benefit from hearing the information, you're going to be able to send the link to this recorded webinar to them following today's presentation. Okay. So here's our agenda. We are going to spend most of our time talking about the new 2016 federal budget bill passed and its effect on the Affordable Care Act. A lot of that time is really going to be focused on the Cadillac tax. Even though it's been delayed 2 years, we still get a lot of questions from our clients about what this really means, what they should be thinking about now to avoid having to pay that tax in the future, and especially any groups with collective bargaining agreements. So we know that even though it's delayed, it's still a hot topic, so we want to make sure you have the most up-to-date information about the Cadillac tax as possible. We're also going to talk a little bit about employer and health plan reporting, which I know is probably near and dear to many of your hearts as you're reviewing your 1095-Cs as we speak and getting those out the door. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the future of the Affordable Care Act. So one quick 30-second commercial about the Partners Group. Again, I know many of you work with us and know who we are, but just a quick review, we are now up to 130 employees strong and growing. We have 4 core divisions, including employee benefits, retirement and investment services, commercial insurance, and business consulting. We're proud to be one of the largest independent firms here in the Northwest with a history that goes back 30 years. So if any of these core divisions represents a need for your firm, we would love to meet with you and talk more about solutions. So with that, let's get on with the show. So I'm going to pass it over to Iris. Iris is going to take the lead this morning talking about PATH, and we'll walk us through all the ACA updates. And I'm just going to jump in along the way and ask questions, and then I will take the lead when we talk about employer strategies. So Iris, thanks for joining us today, and I'll let you take it away.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you all for joining us on, I think, is it raining now? I don't know. It was kind of rainy when I was coming in.
Hope not.
Yeah, I don't know. Who knows what it is going to be. But so I'm going to talk to you, we're going to start with a little bit of discussion of PATH, the Protecting Americans from Tax Hikes Act. Little marketing phrase, I guess, within there. And what we really see, as we'll get into as we talk about the specific provisions that affect the ACA, is that what this does is it delays a lot of the revenue generation measures under the ACA, which from my perspective kind of signals two things. The ACA was designed to be, if not revenue neutral, at least a revenue generator, I think was the hope ultimately from the government side. But then I think that kind of they tailored back a little bit as it's been going into effect, and then ultimately determined perhaps it would be revenue neutral. And what we're seeing is as these provisions get delayed further and further back, the argument for keeping everything in place as is starts to look weaker because it starts to look like a more costly endeavor. So that's just something to think about when you're looking at this in terms of what it signals overall. But we'll be talking a little bit later on at exactly what we think you can expect in terms of the ACA moving forward. And so the three effects that we see within PATH for the ACA are some changes to the health insurance industry tax, the medical device tax, and then also the high-cost plan tax, or the Cadillac tax, which is probably of the three the tax that you're most familiar with, and also of the three the item that we'll be spending the most time on today. But first, looking briefly at the medical device tax and then HIT, or the health insurance industry tax. So the medical device tax levies a tax on medical devices that are sold under insurance policies. And it's one of those taxes that's largely invisible to the employers because you don't necessarily see it unless you have a self-insured plan. What you see is that you see that your insurance rates are a little bit higher. And so what this tax does is it initially it was supposed to go into effect by 12/31/2012, and it was projected to net, as you see on your slide, $30 billion over the course of a decade. So other than the Medicare increase, which is another one of the big taxes that wasn't affected here, it was supposed to be one of the biggest revenue generators within the ACA. What PATH does is it imposes a 2-year moratorium or suspension on the tax, and it's for devices sold in 2016 and 2017. And when you got your rate increases for the 2016 year, this wasn't actually in place yet because kind of per the usual for what we've been seeing for ACA, this went into place kind of mid to late December, and so everything's kind of last minute. I mean, everything we see is absolutely last minute on this, and so you wouldn't have seen this reflected in your rates. I'm hopeful that perhaps, we'll see some type of rate correction the next time around. I don't know, Sarah, if you've thought that that might be a possibility. I mean, it's so hard to know with the ACA.
Yeah. So specific to the health insurance industry tax, it was definitely, that premium for fully insured plans was definitely kind of already baked into those fully insured rates.
Exactly, and I would say that's true of the medical device tax as well. But we always keep our fingers crossed you guys are going to see lower increases in the future. And so for HIT, or the health insurance industry tax, this is the permanent annual fee that's paid by health insurers, and this is for insured plans, not self-insured plans. So these are the plans where a company like Providence or Blue Cross pays the claims as opposed to the claims being paid out of your individual assets. It raised $8 billion in 2014. We were expecting to see an increase up to $4.3 billion in 2018. What PATH does is it imposes a 1-year moratorium on the collection of taxes. So for 2017, the tax won't actually be collected. I know that this is incredibly confusing because it's this random little patchwork, but really what you need to know from the employer side is that we are going to see a little bit of relief on the taxes, which could potentially mean slightly lower rate increases. We just can't say for sure exactly how those are going to be playing out. And as you see on that last line, we're hoping for kind of a 3 to 4% differential in terms of the health insurance industry tax, because at this point it has been baked in historically. So the big one is the Cadillac tax, and this is certainly those two taxes, the medical device tax and then also HIT, are something that I, as an employee benefits attorney, just don't ever get questions on, because ultimately it's a rating issue. And so it's something that you're talking to your brokers about, you're talking to your consultants about, because they're the ones who you're actually discussing rates with, whereas the Cadillac tax becomes more of a planning issue. And so because of that, I sometimes do see those questions come across my desk, as I know that Sarah and the other folks with the partners group do as well. And I think that part of the reason that questions have been so high on this is just that there's been so much confusion. As you'll see as we go through some of these slides, I mean, it's not really 100% sure on how even the tax is going to be broken out among the various payers. It's incredibly vague at this point. So the original intent of the tax was to discourage companies from offering rich health plans instead of higher wages. What has always seemed a little counterintuitive to me is that the plans that are often most affected by this tax are collectively bargained plans. And those are the same plans that you kind of hear that the same group of constituents who are pushing for the Cadillac tax saying, you know what, we're all for a union. So there's definitely a disconnect there. It was projected to raise about $87 billion in the first 8 years, although because we've had these continuing delays with the Cadillac tax, this is just a moving target. And the Cadillac tax is always one of those areas that I've seen bipartisan support against the Cadillac tax. And so it's an area where you should definitely not sit back and assume it's going to disappear. But if a piece of the ACA is vulnerable, the Cadillac tax is certainly one of those pieces. PATH also removed a provision from the Cadillac tax that stated that it was not tax deductible. So now it is a tax deductible component, which is always interesting because a tax deductible tax always seems a little counterintuitive to me. But, you know, I'm not going to argue. If they're going to say something tax deductible, we're just going to go with it. And so basically there'll be adjustments to the annual limit over time. And what PATH did is it requires some studies to be conducted regarding age and gender to determine exactly how the annual limit will be adjusted. All the statute says is it talks about medical inflation, which is incredibly vague because it can be calculated in a bunch of different ways. So we're going to get into a little bit of discussion of exactly what the Cadillac tax means. And while it has been delayed from the original, or I guess the extended effective date of 2018 to 2020, it's certainly something that's still on the horizon for planning purposes. And then for especially those of you who do have collective bargain plans, you are probably thinking about this even more because you may be putting agreements into place that actually span until 2019 or 2020 for a long collective bargaining agreement. So it was part of the 2010 ACA legislation. It was originally supposed to take effect back in 2013, and then it was extended to 2018 and now 2020. This is, like I said, hopeful for the future of the Cadillac tax in terms of the possibility that it may disappear, but it's by no means a sure thing. As any of you who have been following the ACA have seen, I mean, it's been delays on every single item, yet things do actually seem to be going into effect as we go forward. So as noted earlier, the implementation has been delayed for another 2 years based on this federal budget bill, and both parties are calling for repeal. So we believe, and I think that this is probably correct based on the reading that I've done, that this was delayed in order to avoid it being a big fight right now. Basically, we're tabling the issue for discussion later on, and kind of again to keep our fingers crossed that maybe it will be something that ultimately disappears. So what the Cadillac tax is a 40% excise tax on the high-cost health coverage. And so what that means is Cadillac tax sets an amount, and if the cost of the coverage exceeds that amount, then you have a 40% tax on that period, the delta in between what the Cadillac tax says the top amount should be and what it actually costs. So it's not a 40% tax on the full amount, but it is a 40% tax on the difference between what the Cadillac tax thinks you should be paying and what you're actually paying. The tricky thing is, as we'll be talking about a little bit later on, when you're looking at what that amount is that you're determining for Cadillac tax, it includes like everything imaginable, which is definitely an annoying piece of how it's set up right now. And so it excludes some standalone vision and dental programs, but almost everything else is covered when you're thinking about it, and when you're thinking about where you might fall into those into these numbers. There's also no exception for grandfathered groups health plan coverage, which I don't know if any of you, if we were in the room together, I would ask you all to raise your hands and see if anyone raised their hands with a grandfathered health plan. And so I don't know if you want to do that now in your offices right now. You shared. I'm guessing that if you did raise your hands right now, that it would only be a few of you. There are very few grandfathered plans existing out on the marketplace right now. So to give you a little bit of background on the Cadillac tax, what it does ultimately, hopefully you guys can see. We just had a little computer malfunction, like disappeared. Okay, thank you. I'm sure I did something.
You just needed to move the mouse.
Okay. Apparently our computer went to sleep. So as I mentioned, it puts a cap on the amount of tax-free benefits. The tax-free kind of classification of employee benefits has been one of those areas that's been getting a lot of discussion in the last few years. I think that the IRS looks at employee benefits and healthcare as one of those things that's kind of like snuck through over the course of time. Back in World War II was when employee benefits first got that tax-free treatment. And we see sometimes that retirement plan experts are pushing and saying, hey, you know what, you really need to be looking at health. Don't put caps on our plan, and kind of pushing for health to be taxed. And there are certainly groups of people who think that health benefits should be taxed. And nothing in the ACA does in any way create an overall tax on health plans. I know that there was some concern when W-2 reporting came out, but ultimately that could be an indication that health plans would be taxable in the future. At this point, there is nothing to indicate that health plans will ultimately be taxable in a more general sense. But what we do see is this cap that basically puts into effect and says anything above this amount suddenly becomes a taxable benefit at this really high 40% tax rate. And then so currently there's no limit on the value of what you can exclude. Where we do see some exclusions to taxation is where we do have self-insured plans that discriminate in favor of highly compensated people. And then in those situations, you do end up with taxable benefits, and you'll also sometimes see that in the executive benefit context. But as long as it's a plan that's being offered to employees in the more general sense, there is no cap at this point. Cadillac tax changes that. So as we mentioned before, it's to generate about $87 billion in the first 10 years. This is unsurprisingly down from the original projections. For anyone who's kind of been following the ACA from the start and started kind of smiling about this, at the beginning the ACA was kind of marketed as this huge revenue generator, and they've kind of been scaling back in the last 6 years now? Yes, 6 years they've been scaling back. So employers are already scaling back their plans to avoid the tax. We saw about 17% of employers made that change in 2015, and then quite a few more, 40% were seriously considering making changes. And I've definitely been seeing that on my end as well, primarily in the union context, because those plans are often just so rich. But I've also been seeing it where we have a few employers who just offer really, really good health benefits. I know, for example, my husband's company, if we project out where we think the plans are going to be, his plan would probably violate it. It's just a single employer plan, but it just offers really good benefits. And the tax was intended to be a significant funding mechanism for the ACA. Other than the Medicare tax, which you don't really get into in this presentation, it was really designed to be the significant funding mechanism. So if it disappears entirely, that does have a pretty big impact on overall the ACA's fiscal viability moving forward.
And Iris, yes, go ahead. So this is Sarah. A quick question. So can we go back to the previous slide? So the $87 billion that it's expected to generate, I mean, if we see, 17% of employers already making changes, 40% more seriously considering making changes, I mean, wouldn't most people assume, have you heard of any employers who are just willing to pay the tax? I mean, I think that $87 billion is likely going to be reduced to close to nothing as long as employers can avoid it.
No,
has that been your feedback?
Absolutely. Sarah, you make a really good point on that. I think that that's true of many of the ACA revenue generations that are really in essence a penalty is that everyone's just readjusting how they're offering their benefits in order to avoid the tax. I mean, I don't know of any employers who are kind of sleeping at the wheel and not considering whether or not this is going to be a consideration at all. I mean, they're already paying so much for benefits, right, that adding in this additional payment is really not viable for so many. Right. So that's a great point. All right, so how is the tax paid? As I mentioned when we were first starting, it's not 100% clear how the tax is paid, which is great, right? You have this tax that's looming. It was initially looming in 2018. Now it's just 2 years after that. And yet no one can really tell you exactly how you're going to pay it or exactly how it's going to be allocated. This makes a ton of sense for planning purposes. So we have 2 notices from the IRS, both in 2015. And that number at the end where you see 2015-16 and -52, that indicates kind of when they were issued within the year. So both of those were pretty early in 2015. And they requested comments back addressing the definition of applicable coverage, determination of the cost of coverage, annual limits, who will be liable to pay the tax, how the tax is going to be allocated, how the tax will be paid, and then exactly how we deal with situations where we have an employer and they have multiple entities within the same control group. And so all of us in the industry have looked at these notices and said, all right, regulations are on their way. I mean, this was an indication that the IRS was in an information generating mode and trying to determine exactly how these joint regulations were going to be issued. Ultimately, they weren't issued, and so we don't know exactly where the IRS is standing on these issues, but based on the information we do have, we've come up with where we see everything falling with the information that we do have at this point to give you guys an idea. The first big question is, what are we thinking about when we talk about applicable coverage? And the term applicable coverage here is the term that we're using to determine what of your health insurance is actually included in that tax calculation. So when you have a number for 2020 and you know that the Cadillac tax limit for a family or an individual in 2020 is X dollars, what exactly are you putting in that bubble? And the answer is kind of almost everything. As we'll talk about on a later slide, there are a few really limited carve-outs, but I think the big thing to remember is that you're including employer-provided coverage, but you're also including FSAs and HRAs and HSAs contributions within that bubble. And you're including employer and employee contributions for everything. And so I think that a lot of us are really used to thinking about the cost of coverage as an employer contribution issue because we're all trained at this point to be thinking about affordability in terms of ACA penalties. And this is a totally different calculation. We're not worried about affordability at all here. All we're worried about is the total dollars that are being invested in health benefits that don't fall into these really limited exclusive categories for a particular employee. So like I said, almost everything falls within that bubble. Even things like on-site medical clinics, that was something that was really surprising to me when I first saw that. And that's if they're providing more than really de minimis care. So if you have an on-site medical clinic that's only providing flu shots, probably not covered. But if you're allowing your executives to go down and get physicals, probably going to be covered. Retiree coverage is included. Specified disease, illness, and hospital indemnity coverage is also included. And so this is really any time that the premium is going to be excluded from gross income, and that's under Section 106, which is a really broad section for health care. It's going to be included within this definition of Cadillac tax. So ultimately, Cadillac tax is saying anytime you get to exclude it, we're going to be looking at it and figuring out whether it's something that we want to include within our bucket. So what's not included? As I mentioned, there are very few things that aren't included. And please feel free at any point, Sarah, to jump in. I don't need to just barrel forward.
You're doing awesome. Go ahead.
So applicable coverage excludes accident-only or disability and liability coverage. So this is where you'll see you see these plans also operating outside of an AFLIC setting, but an AFLIC setting is often where I particularly see those plans. Other insurance coverage or medical care is secondary or incidental to what the coverage is actually covering. So an accidental death and plan is somewhere where I would potentially say falls into that category. Long-term care, standalone dental or vision, which right now most of you probably do have standalone dental and vision, because we've seen most employers start to carve off their dental and vision because they don't want their dental and vision to be part of that affordability determination when we're talking about ACA penalties. We also have government plans that are maintained primarily for military and their families, and then some specify disease and illness plans. And so we have a carve-out where some of those disease and illness plans do fall under the Cadillac tax and some do not, and the determination there is whether or not it's excludable from income under 106. And so that's something that as this comes up, we can certainly analyze and look at your plans to determine actually what needs to fall within that bucket. But I think the important takeaway for today is just understanding that almost everything is going to fall in there that you're offering on a general, you're offering generally in terms of medical coverage, and that you're looking at employer and employee side premiums. So determination of the cost of coverage. Cost is calculated on a monthly basis, and it's based on the coverage in which the employee is actually enrolled. So this is another point where we're really thinking about something that's really different than the way we've been thinking about ACA before. And the reason is that historically we've been looking at, when we think about ACA, we think about whether an offer of coverage because we're thinking about penalties. And what matters here is actual enrollment. So waivers you're not going to be considering. It's determined differently depending on whether someone has self-only coverage or coverage for their family considered other than self-only. And again, this is a difference than what we see for pay-or-play, because for pay-or-play we're always thinking about, is it affordable just for an individual? Oh, go ahead.
Iris, on this, can you talk a little bit about the calculation is done on an individual by individual basis? So if we've got a group on the line who have 100 employees, that calculation is by each of those 100 employees. So Sally is enrolled as a single employee who makes a $500 contribution to her FSA, who is also pre-tax, supply money for a hospital indemnity plan. Then her calculation is going to be based on those three cost components. That's where Dave, who sits in the cube next to her, may be enrolled in family, but doesn't pre-tax any hospital indemnity coverage and doesn't participate in the FSA. So his calculation is going to be different than Sally's calculation. That's how it's ultimately going to be determined, as employee by employee.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Sarah, for bringing that up. And that does, of course, create a huge cumbersome situation. And for smaller employers, you can kind of just do it on an Excel spreadsheet. But for those larger groups, I think that we'll probably be seeing some type of software solutions, hopefully with a little bit more strength coming out of the gate than some of the ACA reporting software. I'm keeping my fingers crossed on that one. But no, Sarah, that's a great point, that the calculation can be different from employee to employee. I think that when the rules initially came out, a lot of employers were looking at just the cost of their actual medical plan coverage and just multiplying, this is something Sarah and I have discussed, but just multiplying that by 12 and saying, okay, well, where does that fall? But ultimately, because we are looking at elections and contributions to these individualized plans, it does make it a lot more complicated to calculate. So ultimately, the IRS intends the process to be similar to the COBRA premium determination process, where they're looking at substantially similarly situated individuals. But it's not really that simple, because on the COBRA process, you have an individual employee who kind of just checks some boxes, and you're really only dealing with that particular person at a time, where this is much more of a global effort where you're constantly balancing multiple moving parts. And so hopefully there'll be some simplification. I'm not particularly hopeful about that, just because everything has just continued to kind of, I think, spiral to more complicated mechanisms as opposed to less complicated mechanisms when it comes to the ACA. Okay.
The only other thing that I would say that is a common question I get on this topic of cost of coverage is that typically our employers, I mean, with the exception of some of our large public employers who have a composite rate, most of our groups have a 4-tier rate structure. So they have a cost of coverage for employee only, employee and spouse or domestic partner, employee and family, and employee plus child or children. So it's really only those employees who are enrolled as employee only, their cost of coverage is going to be measured against the single
exactly
threshold, and
correct.
anybody enrolled in any of the other 3 tiers would be measured against the higher threshold. So your employees who are enrolled as employee plus spouse or employee plus child or children are going to have more breathing room in the calculation, because generally those premium rates are lower than the family threshold, and people are actually enrolled in the full family tier.
No, and that's a great point, and I think it's a little bit of a silver lining that the law isn't nuanced enough to call out kind of each different type of coverage option that's available. And a question that I do get a lot is what to do with composite rates. And the more recent guidance that we've seen, I think actually this is mentioned on a later slide, does indicate that there will be a special cap for composite rates. What I'm guessing is that anyone, so a composite rate comes up usually in a union trust plan, where what will happen is under the collective bargaining agreement, either the employer will pay a specific amount per month for an enrolled employee to be on the plan, or they'll pay a dollar amount each hour that the employee works. And in either situation, what typically happens is that there's only one rate that the trust puts out. And it doesn't matter if one person is enrolled in the plan or if the employee has 15 dependents and they're all enrolled in the plan, you pay the same rate. And so that was a question initially that came out a lot with some of the groups that I was working with, just in that the question came up, well, what do I do if I have an individual who's enrolled in a trust plan with a composite rate? And the more recent guidance has indicated that there will be some type of rule to deal with that. Kind of previously we have been leaning on the trust to create an individual rate, and we're still doing that just for affordability purposes. And some of them have, some of them haven't. Is that been your experience?
Yeah, well, and it's especially before it was delayed 2 years because we didn't have that clarification on what the allowance was going to be for groups with composite rates. That the guidance to just move away from a composite rate seemed to be kind of the more prudent path to ensure that you didn't have all these singles exceed, triggering this Cadillac tax just because of the way that your rates are structured.
Exactly. When I think that the composite rate can also be an issue for affordability. The other place.
That
come up, and I'm sure you have as well, Sarah. And I'm sorry, I should be introducing myself when we bounce back and forth. I'm assuming our voices sound enough different that you're not seeing that. So there will be special rules for how to determine the amount that you're including in your Cadillac tax bucket for self-insured plans and various types of account-based plans. Those are your FSAs, your HRAs, your HSAs. And we have some guidance on that, not really enough. I'm hoping that we're going to see a lot more guidance on that if this moves forward, which I think we will because we're still really missing the key regulations on this issue. So applicable dollar limits, they were initially set, and remember that these numbers were set in 2010. And so really, we're looking at this point on numbers that are really, really old. So don't panic if your current plan would already meet these requirements because they're really old and they are going to be adjusted up based on a specified cost factor. And so we saw $10,200 for self-only, $27,500 for other than self-only. But as I mentioned, those numbers are really at this point they're not going to be correct at all. We're also going to see some adjustments possible based on population's age and gender mix, based on the national workforce. I think that we also may see some adjustments based on regions because health insurance is more expensive based on state laws in some regions than in others. High-risk status is specifically called out in the statute, actually, and then also retiree status. So we're going to see, I think, multiple numbers ultimately going forward when we get it. And then I have the note, other than self-only limits applies to a multi-employer plan coverage. And so that's ultimately, right now we look at family if we're at a composite rate, but we'll see ultimately how that plays out. So right now it's 11:09, and so I'm going to move pretty quickly through some of the rest of the Cadillac tax stuff because we have, I'm only going to cover the reporting briefly because I think all of you are probably so deep in reporting at this point you do not want to hear about it anymore. But we have a section at the end which I think is kind of fun where we talk about the future of the ACA, and I want to make sure to leave time for that while being respectful of the fact that you're only actually planning to be with us until 11:30 today. So who will be liable to pay the Cadillac tax? Ultimately, it depends. it's going to be passed on to the issuer for insured coverage. But what that means is if you have an insured plan with Cadillac tax liability, you're going to see it in your rates. And so as an employer, ultimately, it's going to come down to you in the end. And so just assume that as we get more information, if the Cadillac tax stays in effect, you're just going to want to make sure to avoid it, because no matter who ends up actually writing the check, it's going to be your cost. So we have a little bit of information on how it's allocated among the different taxpayers. I think that at this point I'm going to go ahead and skip over this information just because we're still a little ways out from it. But if you're reading through, if you have any questions, do always feel free to send a note to Sarah or to send a note to me, and we're happy to answer those questions as well. So how the tax will be paid, we know that it's going to be paid on a calendar year basis. We don't know anything about the specific mechanisms in which it's going to be paid. I mean, there's going to be some type of form, probably an excise tax return form, because the Cadillac tax is considered an excise tax. But it's just going to be another tax form that you'll be informed about, and you'll be filling it out and paying it. If it applies, hopefully we will do our best to ensure that it will not apply to you. That is our goal. And so who is the employer-employer aggregation? I know a fair number of you are in governmental organizations, so this won't apply to you. But if you are in a private organization and you have shared ownership with another entity, and this is where you're thinking about control group here, which you probably already have on the mind for other ACA purposes, there will be some aggregation issues in determining exactly who's responsible for the tax and how it's spread out when you have multiple entities that may or may not be on the same health plan. So that'll just be something to keep in mind in your continued controlled group discussion. So how the cost is determined, we have included here a couple of examples. And I'm going to show you, so this is just kind of a summary form that shows you how it's calculated, where you're taking your aggregate premiums of coverage. So you take what you pay, what the individual employee pays, and then you add in any salary reduction contributions for a health SSA, HRA, FSA, or HSA or MSA. So you add all of those together. Then you subtract what the threshold is. So that's that number that was $10,200 back in 2010, but we're hopeful that it'll be a much, much higher number if this ever takes effect. And then you take that difference, you multiply it by the 40%, and that would equal what your taxes owed. So we have a couple of actual examples in here. And so this one's pretty straightforward, so I'm going to skip it. But I really liked this example on this, well, these two examples on this particular slide, because they show that you have this FSA contribution that's built in. So you're taking your cost of coverage, which in this case we have an example for self only and then other than self only, and that would include, employees plus spouse or employee plus spouse and children, any combination of that, and you add that FSA contribution on there.
And Iris, I just want to make clear, because this is something that I think surprises a lot of employers, that FSA contribution that's used as an example on these slides, that's an employee FSA contribution. It's their health care FSA election, but this is not limited to only including employer contributions to an FSA. These are definitely employee voluntary funds, and we get a lot of employers saying, wait a minute, how can that be included? That's just employees voluntarily participating in the health FSA. I understand it's not intuitive, but those contributions made by the employees absolutely count in these calculations.
Absolutely, and honestly, I mean, if this goes forward, I anticipate that we're going to be seeing much lower FSA caps, which is a bummer, because a lot of employers have had to push their deductibles up some in order to make the coverage affordable to their employees. And so then you have a situation where there's a huge gap, and then when an employee has a major medical issue, they're hopeful that they can at least use pre-tax dollars, but this would make it more difficult to do that, certainly. And so the examples on this page show both an HRA and an FSA contribution. So again, as Sarah mentioned, you're looking at employer and employee contributions here. It's all those dollars that are going in on a tax-free basis. So considerations and strategies, I'm going to let Sarah take over here for a bit.
Yeah, so we'll go through these pretty quickly. Again, we're really trying to balance, all those what ifs that Iris talked about. One is, the thresholds, the 10 to the 27.5. We have to use those in our examples today because those are the only numbers we have. But we're all expecting that those thresholds, if the Cadillac tax moves forward, are going to be raised, and that increase is going to represent basically 10 years of healthcare inflation, although we don't know what those numbers are going to be. So, we're just balancing that, we can't presume that the Cadillac tax is not going to go forward, so we have to start making plans without being so reactive that we're stripping plans now based on arbitrarily low thresholds that were included in the original law. So as we sit with employers and really talk about the Cadillac tax, part of it is, we need to ensure that we're continuing to monitor plan design and the value of these plans very closely. And we've been doing that, against those original thresholds and really talking to employers about where there are risks of potentially exceeding that Cadillac tax today, understanding that we hope that there's some additional breathing room once those final thresholds are published. The other is for those groups who don't have standalone vision and dental plans to really work towards unbundling vision and dental so that we can avoid at least the cost of vision and dental, which we know are smaller portions of the overall cost, but anything that we can strip out of that calculation will help an employer not exceed those Cadillac tax thresholds. So really maintaining standalone vision and dental plans and creating standalone vision and dental plans if they're currently considered bundled with the medical plan. The other is if we've got an employer who has any employee-paid voluntary plans that would be allowed to be pre-tax, so those critical illness plans, cancer policies, hospital indemnity policies. Those are, like Iris said, typically the Colonial Life, Unum products, Aflac products. If we've got those in place and employees are paying those premiums with pre-tax dollars, again, that's something that we really want to talk about because we want to, again, avoid the cost of these types of coverage are sending you over the threshold and triggering a tax where we can. The other is, managing the medical FSA plan closely. We really anticipate that many employers, let's say, the cost of all their coverage allows only $1,000 gap between their cost of cover, or the value of their medical plans and other plans that have to be included in that calculation, and the threshold, that they would say, okay, our FSA, medical FSA cap is $1,000, so that they say, okay, no employee can contribute more to the medical FSA than is that would potentially trigger that threshold. So unfortunately for all of us who love those FSAs, we really think that if the Cadillac tax moves forward, the FSA is going to be one of the levers that's most easy to pull and change every year until at some point we just might not see medical FSAs on a go-forward basis. The other is reducing or eliminating employer contributions to HSAs or HRAs, again, if that is what's potentially causing an employer to exceed that Cadillac tax threshold. Just as I said earlier, we're really advising clients, no matter what your political belief is and what's going to happen next year with the election, as we manage our plans, don't assume that the Cadillac tax will be repealed, even though it's got bipartisan support. I mean, I have been surprised many times over the last 6 years about what we thought and anticipated was going to happen with the ACA and really having things come out of left field. So plan now, take advantage of the 2-year delay, and work closely with your TPG consultant and with advisors like Iris to make sure that you understand as much as you can about what the information that's available now so that you can plan for 2020, especially for those groups, those of you that have collective bargaining agreements in place, and making sure that you've got language that will protect you and give you the flexibility to react to this in the event that it does come to pass, and you've got CBAs that maybe, stretch over 2020. Educate employees. So if you've got employee, kind of benefit blasts or newsletters that go out, just like all of you who are really interested in this topic, our employees are hearing about this on the news. And so keeping your employees informed about what this means and what it means potentially to employee benefits is advised as well. And then, of course, communicate. So not just to your own employees, but ask questions of your advisors. We have done many graphs, kind of modeling where our employers are against the Cadillac tax. I would say, that is interesting information, but it's, again, because we expect those thresholds to increase, we're trying to balance lots of information without people kind of overreacting and pulling back on benefits immediately, because we do expect those thresholds to increase. Okay, let's get to, I think what we're going to do on, we've only got about 7 minutes left. So we're going to just buzz through the employer reporting. We have been hearing from lots of you that, you're at the phase where you're kind of auditing your 1095-C statements, either that you produced in-house or that your third-party payroll vendor has supplied to you to say, okay, here's what's spitting out of our system. Do these look right? So the types of questions we're getting are really around, okay, I've got this 1095-C for this employee and it's using code 1E. Is that the right code? And we're happy to help with those types of questions. But I know that you guys are all neck deep in 1095-C statements. So if you do have specific questions, please reach out to one of your PPG team members who can help you kind of decode the confusions that have been generated by these forms. I will say that for all of our employers who are really working hard to follow the rules of the reporting requirements, the good news is that for 2015, your good faith effort is really going to suffice. So don't lose sleep over the fact that your reports might not be absolutely perfect. You're all working hard to get those forms complete and as accurate as possible. So we really don't think that there's going to be a lot of fines levied against employers who can demonstrate that they did everything they could to follow the rules in 2015. We may not have that same grace in 2016 and moving forward, but everybody's doing this for the first time this year. So do you have anything to add on that?
No, I would absolutely agree that everyone's in an audit mode, and just don't get too nervous. I think that there's a lot of confusion about what safe harbor code to use, and just don't stress it if you're not sure if you're using the safe harbor code. We're happy to answer questions, but it will be okay.
Okay, so let's use the last 5 minutes to predict the presidential election. Shall we, Iris?
Excellent. I can't wait.
Okay.
All right. So public support for the ACA has been dipping quite a bit. And we've quoted some numbers here from the most recent Kaiser Family Foundation poll, where now we're up to 46% of Americans viewing the law unfavorably. And 40% viewing it favorably, of course, that delta in the middle is people who don't have an opinion. But who doesn't have an opinion about the ACA? Come on, this is our life here. But so we're seeing, and this number has been increasing over time. I think that a lot of people were initially thinking that they were going to potentially get really good rates for individual coverage on the exchange, and that hasn't panned out as well as it should. So while some aspects of the ACA certainly remain popular, in particular, dependent coverage through age 26, people tend to really like. And then the ban on pre-existing condition exclusions is also something that has a lot of favorable support. but the issue is that rates just have not been coming out where individuals might expect them to be, and this has just been a huge administrative burden for employers. So we're seeing the ACA kind of dip continually in its support. The House has voted to repeal the ACA several times now, most recently on January 6th. That was vetoed, and there aren't enough votes to push it through. So until there is a change to administrations, we're certainly going to see the ACA continue. And simply the fact that the ACA requirements have been rolled out now over 6 years, and so many of them are already in effect, it is actually incredibly difficult to fully repeal the ACA at this point. So what we're going to be potentially seeing is maybe there would be an ACA replacement. Or what I anticipate is if we do have a change in administration from Democrat to Republican, what we may also just see is just no funds being attributed to the ACA. So it continues to be in effect, but there's no enforcement dollars behind it, making it really difficult for anybody to actually get in trouble for violating any provision of the ACA. So Obama's term, of course, is to end on January 20th, 2017. And so he's going to be using the remainder of the year to push through priority regulation. The key components of the ACA are already in place. I don't imagine we're going to see, my prediction is that I don't think non-discrimination testing, which is kind of the big outstanding issue, is going to come out this year. It doesn't seem to be a priority, whereas we have these pending DOL fiduciary rules that are a priority. So I imagine those would come out first. Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, and I just want to not, I know we're running out of time, but I don't want to skip over the non-discrimination piece. So what Iris is mentioning there is for all of our fully insured clients who are on the line, we've got these non-discrimination rules that were intended to be extended from, they apply currently to self-funded plans, but they were going to apply to fully insured plans, which would mean that fully insured plans couldn't have different waiting periods for highly compensated employees. So you can't have executives be benefit eligible, day to hire, and everybody else has to wait 60 days. You couldn't have a richer benefit structure for highly compensated employees. You couldn't have a management carve-out plan, which is so common for especially smaller employers who have fully insured plans. So this issue of, of non-discrimination rules applying to insured plans was going to have a big impact on a lot of employers. So what you're saying, Iris, is, we've seen that kind of being put on the back burner and it's never being moved again, and you're not anticipating, again, it's a crystal ball, but you're not anticipating that we're going to see much.
No, I think it's just because we've had total silence from the administration for the past 6 years on it. Really just, other than the extension from 2012, we haven't heard a thing.
Yeah.
And so some employers I know have been running into issues in terms of some insurers are already, in essence, those rules, not any of the penalties, but they're,
through underwriting guidelines.
Through underwriting guidelines, exactly. They're just less inclined to have the carve-out plans or plans that do have different terms and conditions, but I don't anticipate we're going to see it this year. It just doesn't seem to be an enforcement priority. So this is just kind of the crystal ball looking at what each of the potential or the leading candidates at this point. I put this together before some of the primaries. So if this has shifted, I don't think it shifted, but if it shifted, I was going to say this could be wrong. We don't really know what Trump would do. He said a lot of different things, and so we're not totally sure about that. Ted Cruz has endorsed repealing Title I. Repealing the ACA is not high on his priority list, at least according to his campaign materials. Title I is almost all of the substance of the ACA. Rubio would repeal the ACA, Clinton would keep it intact, and Sanders, if he had his way, would do a single-payer system.
Thank you all for joining us. We had quite a great turnout for our webinar. We appreciate you taking the time, and please let us know. You can also use the question box for this. If there are topics that you're interested in, we are happy to provide these types of kind of easy one-hour webinars. to add value to you and your team. So if you've got a burning topic that you would love more information on, make those suggestions either through that question box or by emailing me, and we are happy to address those issues and deliver information on topics that are most valuable to you. So that input would be great. So thank you all for attending, and I'm sure we'll be in touch soon. Have a great day.